Where is it? There. Now, now I wonder. Anyway. All right. I think I plug my phone in because it's gonna die, and then I'm gonna. I'm late because a friend of mine told me that there's going to be much stricter. Um, what's the word? Oh, you can't even see me. It's going to be much stricter staying home rules. So I had to go out because I had no cat food. Happy birthday, Ramiro! I'm sorry that your birthday is in the middle of this stupid shit. Oh, I'm sorry. Pretend I didn't say that. All right, so we are on chapter 5. I want to, because I forgot to mention this, and I think maybe it's important. This is supposed to be happening during World War II in Britain when they were having air raids. So these kids were sent to the country, which a lot of people did. They sent their kids to the country because the Germans were not bombing the country, they were bombing London and the cities. So that's why these are country. Okay, chapter 5, back side of the door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others. But when at last they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, "Peter, Susan, it's true. Edmund has seen it too. There is a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there, in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them all about it." "What's all this about, Ed?" said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. "Tell us, Ed," said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look, as if he were far older than Lucy. Really, there was only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, "Oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story about a country in the wardrobe was true. Just for fun, of course. There's really nothing there." Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought he had scored a great success and went on to say, "There she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always—" "Look here," said Peter, turning on him savagely. "Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since you started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go on playing games with her about it and setting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite." "But it's all nonsense," Edmund said, very taken aback. "Of course it's all nonsense," said Peter. "That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to either be going queer in the head or else turning into a most frightful liar. But whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next?" I thought, I thought," said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. "You didn't think of anything at all," said Peter. "It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen that at school before now." "Do stop it," said Susan. "It won't make things better having a row between the two of you. Let's go and find Lucy." It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she had been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, I don't care what you think. I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know that I met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there, and you are all beasts. It was a very unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after she had gone to bed. The result in the next morning was that they decided to go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father if he thinks there's something that's really wrong with Lou. Hi, Ivan. Anyway. Da, 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 da. So they went and knocked on the study door, and the professor said, come in, and got up and found chairs for them, and he said he was quite at their disposal. Then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together, never interrupting, till they had finished the whole story. After that he said nothing for a long time. Then he cleared his throat and said the last thing that either of them expected. How do you know, he asked, that your sister's story is not true? But anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. Then Susan pulled herself together and said, but Edmund said that they had only been pretending. That is the point, said the professor, which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as the more reliable? I mean, which one generally is more truthful? Well, that's the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I would have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, she said, in general, I'd say the same as Peter, but this couldn't possibly be true all about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know, said the professor, and a charge of lying against someone whom you have always found to be truthful is a very serious thing indeed. We were afraid it might not even be lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor. Oh, you can make your minds easy about that. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she is not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor, and she didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor, half to himself. Why don't they teach logic in these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she is telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment, then, and unless you have further evidence, you must assume that she's telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard, and quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why would you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find a country every time they go into the wardrobe? I mean, there was nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend that there was. What has that got to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're real all the time, are they? Said the professor. And Peter didn't quite know what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been gone hours. That is precisely the thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If I say she had gone into another world, I would not be at all surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had just been pretending, she could have hidden for a reasonable amount of time before coming out and telling you her story. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just around the corner, just like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor. taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what do they teach at these schools? But what are we to do? Said Susan. She felt that the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking with a very sharp expression at them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested, and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business. And that was the end of the conversation. After this, things were a good deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject. So for a time, it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end, but that was not to be. This home of the professor's, which even he knew about so little, was so old and famous that people all over England used to come and ask permission to see it. It was the sort of a house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even histories. And well, it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I am telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission. And Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, always showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children, and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things that she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on their first morning, along with a very good many other things, please remember that you are to keep out of the way whenever I'm giving a tour of the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a strange group of grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. That was how the adventures began for the third time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits, when the two girls rushed into the room and said, Look out! Here comes Macready and a whole gang with her. Sharp's the word, said Peter, and all four of them made off to the door at the far end of the room. But when they got out of the green room and beyond it, there was voices ahead of them, and realized that Mrs. Macready was bringing her party up the back stairs instead of the front stairs. And after that, whether it that they lost their heads or Macready was trying to catch them, it seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, and until at last Susan said, Oh, bother these trippers. Let's go into the wardrobe room until they pass. No one will follow us in there. But the moment they were inside, they heard the voices in the passage and someone fumbling at the door. Quick, said Peter. There's nowhere else. He flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, because, of course, he remembered, as any sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourself in a wardrobe. Chapter 6, Into the Forest. I wish the Macready would hurry up and take these people away. I'm terribly cramped, said Susan. And what a filthy smell of camphor, said Edmund. I expect the pockets of these coats are full of it, said Susan, to keep away the moths. There's something sticking into my back, said Peter. And isn't it awfully cold, said Susan. Now that you mention it, it is cold, said Peter. Hang on, it's all wet, too. What's the matter with this place? I'm sitting on something wet, and it's getting wetter. Let's get out, said Edmund. They've gone. Oh, said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what was the matter. I'm sitting against a tree, and look, it's getting light over there. By Jove, you're right, said Peter, and look there, and there. It's trees all around, and this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we've gotten into Lucy's wood after all. And now there was no mistaking it, and all four children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them were coats hanging on pegs. In front of them were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. I apologize for not believing you, Lucy. I am sorry. Will you shake hands? Of course, said Lucy, and did. And now, said Susan, what do we do next? Do, said Peter. Why, go and explore the wood, of course. Oh, said Susan, stamping her feet. It's pretty cold. What about putting on these coats? They're not ours, said Peter. I'm sure nobody would mind, said Susan. It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We won't even be taking them out of the wardrobe. I never thought of that, Sue, said Peter. Of course, now that you put it that way, no one could ever say that you stole a coat as long as you leave it in the wardrobe where you found it. And I suppose this whole country is in the wardrobe. They'd immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than coats. But they all felt a great deal warmer, and each thought the others looked better in their new get-up and more suitable to the landscape. We can pretend we're Arctic explorers, said Lucy. This is going to be especially exciting without pretending, said Peter. They were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked as there might be more snow. I say, said Edmund, ought we bearing a bit more to the left if we are aiming for the lamp post? He had forgotten for a moment that he must pretend to have never been there, and the moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized he had given himself away. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared at him, and Peter whistled. So you really were here, he said. That time Lou says she met you in here, and you made out that she was telling lies? There was a dead silence. Well, all poisonous little beast, said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed indeed no more to say, and presently the four resumed their journey. But Edmund was saying to himself, I'll pay you all out of this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied kids. Where are we going anywhere? Said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. I think Lou ought to be the leader, said Peter. Goodness knows, she deserves it. Where will you take us, Lou? How about we go see Mr. Tumnus, said Lucy. He's the nicest fawn I told you about. Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. Lucy proved a good leader. At first she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree in one place and a stump in another, and brought them to where the ground became uneven and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there a terrible surprise awaited them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside, the cave was dark and cold and had a damp feeling and the smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in from the doorway and heaped on the floor, mixed with something black, which turned out to be the charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung it about the room and then stamped it out. The crockery lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been slashed into shreds with a knife. This is a pretty good washout, said Edmund. Not much good coming here. What is this? Said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet to the floor. Is there anything written on it? Said Susan. Yes, I think there is, said Peter, but I can't read it in this light. Let's go out into the open air. They all went out into the daylight and crowded around Peter as he read the following words. The former occupant of these premises, the fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting his trial on a charge of high treason against her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia, Chantelane of Cair Paravel, and Empress of the Lone Islands, also of comforting her said Majesty's enemies, harboring spies, and fraternizing with humans. Don Grim, Captain of the Sea Queen. The children stared at each other. I don't know what I'm going to like this place after all, said Sue. Who is this queen, Lou? Said Peter. Do you know anything about her? She isn't a real queen at all, answered Lucy. She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people, hate her. She has made an enchantment over the whole country that has it always winter here and never Christmas. I wonder if there's any point in going on, said Susan. I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it looks as if it won't be much fun either. It's getting colder every minute, and we've brought nothing to eat. What about just going home? But we can't, said Lucy. Don't you see? We can't go home, not after this. It's all on my account that the poor fawn got into trouble. He hid me from the witch, and he showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the queen's enemy and fraternizing with humans. We must simply rescue him. A lot we could do, said Edmund, when we haven't even got anything to eat. Shut up, you, said Peter, who was still very angry with Edmund. What do you think, Susan? I have a horrible feeling that Lou is right. I don't want to go a step further, and I wish we'd never come. but I think we must try to do something for Mr. Whatever his name is. I mean, the fawn. That's what I feel too, said Peter. I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting back into this country again once you've gotten out of it, so I think we'll have to go on. So do I, said both the girls. If only we knew where the poor chap was in prison, said Peter. They were still wondering what to do next when Lucy said, Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder if birds can talk in Narnia. It almost looks as if it wants to say something to us. Then she turned to the robin and said, Please, can you tell where Tumnus the fawn has been taken? And as she said this, she took a step towards the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as the next tree. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as it was trying to understand all they had been saying. Without noticing they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer. At this, the robin flew again to the next tree and looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder breast or a brighter eye. Do you know, said Lucy, I really believe he means us to follow him. I've an idea he does, said Susan. What do you think, Peter? Well, we might as well try it, answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow. In this way it led them on, slightly downhill. Wherever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently the clouds overhead and the winter sun came out, and all the snow around them grew dazzlingly bright. They had been traveling in this way for about half an hour when the two girls in front, when Edmund said to Peter, If you're not still too high and mighty to talk to me, I've something to say which you'd better listen to. What is it? Said Peter. Hush, not so loud, said Edmund. There's no good frightening the girls, but you have realized what we're doing. What? Said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. We're following a guide that we know nothing about. How do we know which side that bird is on? Why shouldn't it be leading us into a trap? That's a nasty idea. Still a robin, you know. They're good birds in all the stories I've ever read. I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side. If it comes to that, which is the right side, how do we know that the fawns are in the right and the queen, yes, I know, we've been told that she's a witch, is in the wrong? We really don't know anything about either one. The fawn saved Lucy. He said he did, but how do we know? And there's another thing, too. Has anyone got the slightest idea of the way home from here? Great Scott, said Peter. I hadn't thought of that. No chance of dinner, either, said Edmund. Chapter 7. A Day with the Beavers. While the two boys were whispering, behind, both girls suddenly cried, Oh! and stopped. The robin, cried Lucy, it's flown away. And so it had, out of sight. And now what are we to do? Said Edmund, giving Peter a look, which was as much to say, What did I tell you? Shh, look, said Susan. What? There's something moving among the trees over there to the left. They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. There it goes again, said Susan presently. I saw it that time too, said Peter. It's still there. It's just gone beyond the tree. What is it? Asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. Whatever it is, said Peter, it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen. Let's go home, said Susan. And then, though nobody said it out loud, everyone realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. What's it like? Said Lucy. It's kind of an animal, said Susan. And then, look, quick, there it is. They saw it all of them saw it, a whiskered furry face which had looked out of them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against his mouth, just as humans put their finger to their lips when they are signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood, holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced all around as if it were afraid someone was watching, and said, Hush, made signs to them to join it in the thicker part of the wood where it was standing, and then once more disappeared. I know what it is, said Peter. It's a beaver. I saw the tail. It wants us to go to it, said Susan, and it is warning us not to make noise. I know, said Peter. The question is, are we going to do it or not? What do you think, Lou? I think it's a nice beaver, said Lucy. Yes, but how do we know that? Said Edmund. Well, shan't we have to risk it, said Susan. I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel I want some dinner. At this moment, the beaver popped its head from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly for them to come. Come on, said Peter, let's give it a try. All keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy. So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and behind it, and there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, further in, come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open. Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. Are you the sons of Adam and daughters of Eve? It said. We're some of them, said Peter. Shh, said the beaver. Not so loud, please. We're not safe, even here. Why, who are you afraid of? Said Peter. There's no one here but ourselves. There are the trees, said the beaver. They're always listening. Most of them are on our side. There are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean. And it nodded its head several times. If it comes to talking about sides, said Edmund, how do we know you're a friend? Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver, added Peter, but you see, we're strangers. Quite right, said the beaver. Here is my token. With these words, it held up to them a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise until suddenly Lucy said, Oh, of course, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus. That's right, said the beaver. The poor fellow got wind of the arrest before it actually happened and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here and take you on to, and here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave 1 or 2 very mysterious nods. Then, signaling to the children to stand as close around as it possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whiskers, it added in a low whisper, They say Aslan is on the move, perhaps has already landed. And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was, any more than you do, but at the moment the beaver spoke those words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if it has an enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all of your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that. At the name of Aslan, each of the children felt something jump in their insides. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter suddenly felt brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or delightful strain of music had just floated by. And Lucy got a feeling when you have to wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or just the beginning of summer. And what about Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. Where is he? Shh, said the beaver. Not here. I must bring you where we can have a real talk and also dinner. No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very, very glad to hear the word dinner. They therefore all hurried behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry, when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them, and the ground began to fall steeply downhill. A minute later, they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden that they've made or reading a story that they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say hush this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished. But the dam there was what ought to have been a beautiful pool, but was now a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth, it was all frozen into foamy, wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing at the very moment the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting over the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered with flowers and wreaths and festooned in the purest sugar. And out in the middle, partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house, shaped rather like an enormous beehive. And from a hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed. But Edmund noticed something else. A little down the river, there was another small river, which came down to another small valley to join it. And looking up at that valley, Edmund could see the two hills, and he was almost sure they were the two hills where the White Witch had pointed. And then between them, he thought, that must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself. Horrible ideas came into his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, "and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I will lead the way, but be careful and don't slip." The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans. It was a very fine place to walk, but it was covered in ice, and though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they reached the middle, they were at the door of his house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve," and they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine, and it was from that that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding out her wrinkled old paws. At last, to think that I have ever lived to see this day. The potatoes are boiling and the kettle is singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish." "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice that he kept open every day with a hatchet. He took a pail with him, and Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so very chilly. He looked hard into it, and suddenly shot in his paw, and before you could say Jack Robinson, he whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner. And she put on the frying pan to get it dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures. Instead of beds, there were bunks, like on board a ship, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging, and against the wall were gum boots and oilskins and hatchets and shears and spades and trowels and things for carrying mortar in and fishing rods and fishing nets. The cloth on the table was very clean, but very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife and cleaned out in the open air. You can think how good the new caught fish smelled when they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they became before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own rocking chair. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go on his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it had been alive an hour ago and has come out of the pan a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll and the tea had been made and poured, and when each person got his or her cup of tea, they shoved back to their stool so they could lean against the wall and gave a great sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea toward him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely, why now we can get down to business. It's snowing again," he added. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow us, they won't find any tracks." Let me see how long the next chapter is. I'll read one more chapter. What time is it? Oh, yeah, I've only been reading for 37 minutes. Chapter 8. What happened after dinner? "And now," said Lucy, "please do tell us what happened to Mr. Tumnus." "Oh, that's bad," said Mr. Beaver. "It's a very nasty, nasty business, and there's no doubt he's been taken off by the police. I got that from a bird who saw it done." "But where has he been taken to?" asked Lucy. "Well, they were heading northwards when they were last seen, and we all know what that means." "No, we don't," said Susan. Mr. Beaver shook his head in a very gloomy fashion. "I'm afraid it means they were taking him to her house," he said. "But what'll they do to him, Mr. Beaver?" gasped Lucy. "Well," said Mr. Beaver, "we can't say exactly for sure, but there's many that have been taken in that have never come out again. Statues. All full of statues, they say it is, in the courtyard, up the stairs, and in the hall. People she has turned," he paused and shuddered, "turned into stone." "But, Mr. Beaver," said Lucy, we must do something to save him. It's too dreadful, and it's all on my account." "I don't doubt that you'd save him if you could, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver, "but you've no chance of getting into that house against her will and ever coming out alive." "Couldn't we have some stratagem?" said Peter. "Couldn't we dress up with something and pretend to be, I don't know, peddlers or something, and wait until she's gone out? Or, hang it all, there must be some way. This fawn saved my sister at his own risk, Mr. Beaver. We can't just leave him to to have done this to him." "It's no good, son of Adam," said Mr. Beaver. "No good your trying. You of all people, but now that Aslan is on the move—" "Oh, yes, tell us about Aslan," said several of their voices at once. For once again that strange feeling, like the first sign of spring, like good news, had come over them. "Who is Aslan?" asked Susan. "Aslan?" asked Mr. Beaver. "Why, don't you know? He's the king. He's the lord of the whole wood. But he's not often here, you understand. Never in my time or my father's time. But the word has reached us that he has come back. He is in Narnia at this moment. He'll settle the White Queen all right. It is he, not you, who will save Mr. Tumnus." "So she won't turn him into stone too?" said Edmund. "Lord love you, son of Adam, what a simple thing to say," said Mr. Beaver with a great laugh. "Turn him into stone. If she can stand on her 2 feet and look him in the face, it'll be the most she can do, and more than I could expect of her. No, no, no. He'll put it all to rights, as it says in an old rhyme in these parts. Wrong will be right when Aslan comes in sight. At the sound of his roar, sorrows will be no more. When he bares his teeth, winter meets its death, and when he shakes his mane, we'll have spring again. You'll understand when you see him. But shall we see him? Asked Susan. Why, daughter of Eve, that's what I brought you here for. I'm to lead you to where you shall meet him, said Mr. Beaver. Is he a man? Said Lucy. Aslan a man? Certainly not, said Mr. Beaver. I tell you he is the king of the wood, and the son of the great emperor beyond the sea. Don't you know who is the king of the beasts? Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Oh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel very nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and make no mistake, said Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I'm longing to see him, said Peter, even if I do feel frightened when it comes to it. That's right, son of Aslan, said Mr. Beaver, bringing his paws down on the table with a crash that made all the cups and saucers rattle. And so you shall. Word has been sent that you are to meet him, tomorrow, if you can, at the stone table. Where's that? Said Lucy. I'll show you, said Mr. Beaver. It's down the river, a good step from here, but I'll take you to it. But meanwhile, what about poor Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. The quickest way for you to help him is by going to meet Aslan, said Mr. Beaver, and once he's with us, then we can begin doing things. Not that we don't need you too, for there's another of the old rhymes. When Adam's flesh and Adam's bones sit at Cair Paravel enthroned, the evil time will be over and done. So things must be drawing near their end now that he's come and you've come. We've heard of Aslan coming in these parts before, long ago. Nobody can say when, but there's never been any of your race here before. That's what I don't understand, Mr. Beaver, said Peter. I mean, isn't the witch herself a human? She'd like us to believe it, said Mr. Beaver, and it's on that she bases her claim to be queen. But she's no daughter of Eve. She comes from your father Adam's. Here Mr. Beaver bowed. Your father Adam's first wife? They called her Lilith? And she was one of the jinn. That's what she comes from on the one side. And the other side, she comes from giants. No, no, no. There isn't a drop of real blood in the witch. Not human blood, anyway. That's why she's bad all through, Mr. Beaver, said Mrs. Beaver. True enough, Mrs. Beaver, he replied. There may be two views about humans, meaning no offense to the present company, but there's no two views about things that look like humans and aren't. I've known some good dwarfs, Mrs. Beaver said. So have I, now that you come to speak of it, but precious few, and they weren't the ones least like men, but in general, take my advice. When you meet anything that's going to be human and isn't yet, or used to be human once and isn't now, or ought to be human and isn't, you keep your eyes on it and feel for your hatchet. That's why the witch is always on the lookout for any humans in Narnia. She's been watching for you this many a year, and if she knew there were four of you, she'd be more dangerous still. What's that to do with it? Asked Peter. Because of another prophecy. Down at Cair Paravel, that's the castle on the seacoast down by the mouth of the river, which ought to be the capital of our whole country if all was as it should be. Down at Cair Paravel there are four thrones, and it's a saying in Narnia time, out of mind, when two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve sit on those four thrones, then it will be the end not only of the White Witch, but of her life. And that is why we have to be so cautious when you came along. For if she knew that there were four, your lives wouldn't be worth a shake of my whiskers. All the children had been attending so hard to what Mr. Beaver was telling them that they had noticed nothing else for a long time. Then, during the moment of silence that followed his last remark, Lucy suddenly said, I say, where's Edmund? There was a dreadful pause, and then everyone began asking, Who saw him last? How long has he been missing? Is he outside? And then they all rushed to the door and looked out. The snow was falling thickly, and the green ice of the pond had vanished under a thick white blanket. And from where the little house stood in the center of the dam, you could hardly see either bank. Out they went, plunging well over their ankles in new soft snow, and went around the house in every direction. Edmund! Edmund! They called, until they were hoarse. But the silent snow seemed to muffle their voices. How perfectly dreadful, said Susan. Oh, I wish we'd never come here. What on earth are we to do, Mr. Beaver? Said Peter. Do? Do? Said Mr. Beaver. We must be off at once. We haven't a moment to spare. Well, we'd better divide into 4 search parties, said Peter, and all go in different directions, and whoever finds him must come back here at once. Search parties? Son of Adam, said Mr. Beaver. What for? Why, to look for Edmund, of course. There's no point in looking for him, said Mr. Beaver. What do you mean, said Susan. He can't be far away. And we've got to find him. What do you mean to say there's no use in looking for him? The reason there's no use in looking, said Mr. Beaver, is that we know where he's already gone. Everyone stared in amazement. Don't you understand, said Mr. Beaver. He's gone to her, to the White Witch. He has betrayed us all. Oh, surely. Oh, really, said Susan. He can't have done that. Can't he? Said Mr. Beaver, looking very hard at the 3 children, and everything they wanted to say died on their lips. For each felt suddenly quite certain that this is exactly what Edmund had done. But will he know the way? Said Peter. Has he been in this country before? Said Mr. Beaver. Has he ever been here alone? Yes, said Lucy, almost in a whisper. I'm afraid he has. And did he tell you what he had done or who he had met? Well, no, he didn't, said Lucy. Then mark my word, said Mr. Beaver. He's already met the White Witch and joined her side, and been told where she lives. And I don't like to mention it before, being that he's your brother and all, but the moment I set eyes on that brother of yours, I said to myself, treacherous. He had the look of one who had been with the witch and eaten her food. You can always tell them if you lived in Narnia, something about their eyes. All the same, said Peter, in a rather choking sort of voice. We still have to go look for him. He is our brother, after all, even if he is rather a little beast, and he's only a little kid. Go to the witch's house, said Mrs. Beaver. Don't you see that the only chance of saving him or yourselves is to keep away from her? What do you mean? Said Lucy. Why, all she wants is to get all 4 of you. She's thinking all the time about those 4 thrones at Cair Paravel. Once you were all 4 inside her house, her job would be done. There'd be 4 new statues in her collection before you had time to speak. But she'll keep him alive as long as he's the only one she's got, because she wants to use him as a decoy, as bait to catch the rest of you. Oh, can no one help us? Said Lucy. Only Aslan, said Mr. Beaver. We must go and meet him. That's our only chance now. It seems to me, my dear, said Mrs. Beaver, that this is very important to know just when he slipped away. How much he can tell her depends on how much he heard. For instance, have we talked about before he left? If not, then we may do very well, for she won't know that Aslan has come tomorrow to Narnia, and that we are meeting him, and will be quite off her guard as far as that is concerned. I don't remember his being here when we were talking about Aslan, began Peter, but Lucy interrupted him. Oh, yes, he was, she said miserably. Don't you remember? It was he who asked whether the witch couldn't turn Aslan into stone. So he did, by Jove, said Peter. Just the sort of thing he would say, too. Worse and worse, said Mr. Beaver. And the next thing is this. Was he still there when I told you that the meeting place for Aslan was the stone table? And of course, no one knew the answer to this question. Because if he was, continued Mr. Beaver, she'll simply sledge down in that direction and get between us and the stone table and catch us on our way down. In fact, we shall be cut off from Aslan. But that isn't what she'll do first, said Mrs. Beaver. Not if I know her. The moment that Edmund tells her that we're all here, she'll set out to catch us this very night. And if he's gone about a half an hour, she'll be here in about another 20 minutes. You're right, Mrs. Beaver, said her husband. We must all get away from here, and there's not a moment to lose. All right, look at that. Another 50 minutes and another 4 chapters. Tomorrow night I will read again at 7. I just, like I said at the beginning, found out from a friend of mine, and I can't say if it's true or not true, that there may be some more serious restrictions or curfews coming. So I needed to get cat food because I love my cats. So that is that. I hope you are all well. Are you okay? Ramiro, are you still here? What are you doing for your birthday while in quarantine? I don't see anybody typing. All right. I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'm going to post a copy of this. So if you want to tell your friends, tell everybody. I think it's really funny that every single person that is in this room is not a 6th grader. So, all right. I love you guys. And I will see you tomorrow night. Goodbye. Be safe.